and welcome to Whitley Penn Talks. This is John Williamson, partner in Risk Advisory Services, and with me, as always, is Jesus Vega, who is our resident cybersecurity expert, if I do say so myself. Today, we want to go over information security compliance. Throughout this podcast series, we've primarily been focused on large breaches, what went wrong, and going over the technical specifications of how somebody might prevent or detect a breach from occurring. Today, we'd like to specifically focus on information security compliance and how that may impact your organization. Why is it important? Well, I think one of the more important things that you should think about when it comes to compliance is the fact that if there are any breaches, it can wreak havoc, particularly from a fine perspective. Recent news headlines indicated that Amazon had a significant event where it violated GDPR rules. Essentially, what that landed them was an $887 million fine for non-compliance. The notice was buried within the latest SEC filing from Amazon. It said that the decision was made by the Luxembourg National Commission. There wasn't a lot of details on what the issue was. However, we do know that there is a pretty significant and hefty fine that is coming Amazon's way, and they're going to do their best to fight it. Looking at other headlines, we know that there have been other significant issues. Equifax comes to mind. There was a $557 million fine for the Equifax breach in 2017, whereby the FTC and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau gave significant levied fines for that breach. So, Jesus, I have my first question for you today. There are a lot of information security frameworks available. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of the ones that are out there and how we might go about picking a framework to comply with.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, John, for that. And hello, everybody. Good to be back. We have noticed in our industry that organizations are being asked to provide evidence of having a framework in place to make sure that their security controls are adequately designed and implemented. And we've noticed that there's a common denominator on the types of frameworks that organizations are using. The most prevalent one for service providers is a SOC 2 report, specifically on security, availability, and confidentiality. Those are the most typical SOC reports that we see. We also see that there's reports on ISO 27001. Some of the newer frameworks that are coming into the market field is High Trust, and the Cloud Security Alliance has their own framework. So these frameworks are all good by themselves, and as we can discuss a little bit of them, the overlap, because they talk about privacy, security, availability, processing integrity. If you break it down, they all touch on the same areas. The NIST framework, which is usually a guiding force behind these, it might not be word per word, but you'll notice that all of them will have some sort of identity management or access management. They'll have asset protection. They'll have detection of anomalies and events, or monitoring, as we know it in the SOC world. They'll have respond, and then they'll have recoverability. So these frameworks, they have different words for these areas, but they all have the same approach. Is your organization addressing the security? Now, going back to your original question, these frameworks have a niche market. Most governments are going to be looking for a NIST standard on cybersecurity or risk assessment. However, the NIST standards are self-assessed, so more likely a third party will not take your self-assessment because you're checking yourself off on your controls and how good they are. The ISO 27001 is an independent assessment. So is the SOC 2. And the High Trust. So those were the ones that I said earlier are the more common ones because they're independently attested opinions on your security controls.
Okay, so I think that's a good overview, and we've got a lot of acronyms there, which I've often find cybersecurity to be really the perfect combination of CPAs and security practitioners coming together to come up with a lot of acronyms and use them over and over again. So let's take a moment and we'll define some of those. But before we do that, one of the common guiding principles whenever I talk to our clients and prospective clients about security frameworks and compliance, how do you pick one? Well, I think it's usually governed by either the type of data that you have or the sector in which you operate. So for example, I think we're all commonly, we're familiar with PII, which is personally identifiable information. This can be name, address, phone number, social security number, and any combination of those that can be uniquely tied to a person. If you look at the healthcare sector, any particular medical data is commonly known as protected health information, or PHI. And if your organization or companies that you partner with deal with PHI, you're most likely going to have to deal with HIPAA compliance. Similarly, a lot of us are forced into compliance with a particular framework because of a customer contract. And this is really where it starts to hit home. Most of our clients come to us and say, all right, can you help us figure out a path to compliance? We either have a really big client that wants us to sign a contract that requires us to do it, or even worse, we've already signed a contract and we're already providing services or delivering goods, but we have not even thought about compliance yet. So most of the time, you're going to look at the data, your industry, and in particular, what your clients are requesting. Now, those are some general guidelines. Jesus, you gave us a lot of acronyms, a lot of compliance frameworks. Let's start with SOC reporting. And just to be clear, in the security space, SOC sometimes can stand for Security Operations Center. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a report that is developed by a CPA firm. Broadly speaking, it's System and Organization Control Report. Used to be known as Service Organization Control Report. This is System and Organization Control Report. Jesus, can you give us a brief overview of what a SOC report is and how we can navigate through the different types of SOC reports available to us?
Yeah, definitely. So a SOC report, like I said earlier, constitutes on multiple criteria. The one that you have to have in your SOC report is the security criteria, which has controls on obtaining information from the client, so you provide good services, onboarding your new hires. You have controls on monitoring your environment to make sure that everything's operational and working as designed. You have controls on change management, meaning that whenever somebody makes a change to production, that is approved by the leadership of the organization. Do you have controls on risk assessment? So, every organization will have risk. The question is your organization aware of the risk? Have they accepted the risk, compensated for the risk, or shifted the risk somewhere else, such as obtaining services from another entity, for example, a data center, where you shift the risk of you managing your infrastructure to somewhere else. So that's the bare minimum of SOC report. Then you can add additional components to that SOC report, such as availability, where we make sure that we verify the controls that we have to maintain those operations, such as backups, disaster recovery, testing those backups to make sure they're operational. You can add confidentiality, which is very simply, is your data protected? Is it encrypted? You can add privacy, which as it states, do you have controls to ensure that the data is used correctly? Make sure that the data is used only for those purposes, and when you no longer need it, you dispose of it properly. And then processing integrity, which is basically what controls do you have for quality assurance and making sure that every input is accepted as intended and the output of the data results in a format that you were expecting.
So, fantastic overview of the criteria for a SOC 2 report. Now, if I may, I'm just going to take a step back briefly and go over the different kinds of SOC reports, and then also just kind of have a brief history lesson on where these came from. So, There are a variety of kinds of SOC reports. You'll most frequently hear SOC 1, SOC 2, sometimes SOC 3. The origin of these reports came from SAS 70. There were even some auditing standards before that. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, as organizations began outsourcing certain components of their business, there became a significant audit risk because an auditor needs to gain an understanding of controls in place at their audit client. If they're outsourcing a significant portion of their business activities, that can become problematic. So the premise is this. A CPA firm goes in and audits the internal controls of the service organization. They deliver a report that then gets distributed to all of the service organization clients. This is to reduce the number of audit requests. If you've got larger organizations like ADP or Paychex or UltiPro, payroll processing organizations, they could field 100 different requests from their customers and from their customers' auditors. Well, this is intended to be a silver bullet where a CPA can produce one report. That report goes to all of its customers. Now, that's the history and the story behind it. SAS 70 was the governing standard throughout the 90s and 2000s. We go to 2011, and then there's a change in the attest language, and we begin referring to SOC reports. So a SOC 1 is really the new SAS 70. The goal of that is to be used in an annual audit of financial statements. So you've got a service organization that's processing transactions on behalf of its client, then a SOC 1 is the right report for you. A SOC 2, which Jesus just gave you a fantastic overview of, is really any service organization that has sensitive data that must belong to its customers or clients, and their clients are interested in the security controls in place at that service organization. The criteria listed in those SOC 2, security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. And then finally, we get to SOC 3. SOC 3 is very similar to a SOC 2, but it's a general use report. It's less detailed and can be posted to websites and made available to the general public. Now, those are the three common SOC reports that we've been dealing with really for the past decade or so. There are some newer ones that are beyond the scope of this particular discussion. SOC for cybersecurity and SOC for supply chain. Those are options that are made available to you. We can discuss those at a later date. But right now, we really just want to focus on SOC 2. That's the bulk of this conversation because that's the most predominant SOC report in the industry for cybersecurity frameworks or compliance. So moving forward then, we gave you an overview of SOC 2 reports. Now, Jesus, what's next on the list?
We can kind of overview the NIST cybersecurity framework that is usually used for companies who want to self-assess. As I alluded earlier, these they overlap. So the NIST framework, which a lot of organizations are using to self-assess the risk, will have a lot of overlap. So I'll give you a quick overview of different areas. I would encourage any of our listeners to considering doing a risk assessment themselves because you'd be surprised how many times we have the tools in place. We just need to start thinking about what is the concern that we have and how do we fix it. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is a new iteration of it's a new iteration of the NIST framework that has been put together to accommodate multiple frameworks that were before it. NIST 171 morphed into what is called the cybersecurity, and it's version 1 currently.
And to be clear, just to back up and define those acronyms, NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a non-regulatory agency that is a part of the United States Department of Commerce, but it is a very effective standard-setting body, in particular geared towards federal agencies. NIST has, however, it has, broadly speaking, widely gone through just about every single sector and is one of the best known and accepted security frameworks out there for public use.
Thank you, John. Yes, and the framework itself covers identity, asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment. We go into the different section of protecting the information. which is awareness and training, data security, information protection procedures. We have detection. So how do we monitor our environment? Responding, incident response plan, communication. So those, in case of an event, how do you notify your clients? And lastly, recoverability. If there's some sort of data loss, how can we recover it? Every computer out there, regardless of how fancy and state of the art is, and host it on your environment or in a cloud environment, there's a risk of data loss. So you'll notice that there's some overlap to what we said earlier from the SOC criteria on the SOC 2. This is overlapping. The difference is the SOC is done by an independent auditor, and the NIST cybersecurity framework is intended for you to self-assess.
So next, Jesus, what I'd like to focus on is ISO 27001. So ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. However, it is a worldwide organization. I think actually it was developed in one of the Romantic languages, and you can switch the adjective and the noun. So it's known as ISO. So ISO has developed a number of frameworks and standards that's governed in series of thousands. And it covers management systems of all different types of varieties. I think one of the most common ones before the 27,000 series was the 9,000 series. And the 9,000 series governed quality management systems, particularly for manufacturing. But we get to the 27,000 series and we see a set of standards that governs information security management systems. Jesus, can you walk us through some of the components of ISO 27000 series and how that may be useful for us?
Yes, definitely. So with the risk of sounding redundant, the 27001 covers the following domains. Security policies, so which is the documentation that you have in your organization to make sure that the rules are established. Organizational of information security, asset management. I'll pause a little bit here and kind of take the conversation a little bit out of scope, because this is something that I want to inject. My security hat is coming online, and I want to premise this. We need to know every single asset that we have in the environment so we can protect it. Going back to the conversation at hand, this is one of the domains for the 27001. Then we move to human resources security, which is, as it indicates, onboarding, offboarding, timely access removal, properly vetting and approving access to the system, access control, making sure that access to the different solutions is appropriate based on role-based access or any other way that you measure it to be deemed appropriate, information system acquisition, development and maintenance, fancy words for change management, information security incident response plan, business continuity management in case of an event. How do you maintain operations? So you disaster recovery. And then, of course, at the end, we talk about compliance. This is part of the 27,000. This is part of the 27,001 domains. And as you can see, there's a lot of overlap.
There is, yeah. I think out of everything that you've listed, Jesus, I'm seeing a lot of overlap between the different frameworks that we've discussed. Something that we get commonly asked from our clients is SOC 2 versus ISO 27001. Which is the right framework? Which is the right report? I don't know if I have a really great answer to that. What I can tell you about the ISO 27000 series is it's been in place longer than the SOC 2 reporting standard. I think it's very common, in particular in Europe, whereas SOC reporting is a little more common in North America. I've dealt with clients that have had ISO 27001 compliance built into contracts, and contracts that go decades old. Well, I say decades, probably 15 or 16 years, because I think that's when the standard was developed. But it's been something in place legacy-wise for quite a while. Let me ask you this, Jesus. Is there a certification for ISO 27001 if you need to demonstrate your compliance to a third party?
There is a certification you can obtain by attesting to the controls. The framework for the ISO 27001 is publicly available, so you should be able to obtain that and kind of review it. Once you verify you have your controls in place, you can have a third party go in and attest that those controls have been satisfactorily met.
And to be clear, the party that does the certification, if you want the actual certificate itself, it needs to be done by a certification body, which goes through an accreditation process. There are a lot of organizations throughout the world that do that, fewer in the United States than abroad, I would say, but it's an option that's made available to you. If you needed to, could you add ISO 27001 to your SOC 2 report?
That is something that our clients have been doing. They've been adding a SOC 2 report with a ISO 27001 to it in an effort to show that they comply with the SOC standards, and also for those clients that operate overseas that they have the 27001 framework covered.
Okay, yeah, and I think it's a really good option, and it's one of the more ingenious parts of the SOC 2 report is the ability to add on various frameworks so that you can demonstrate that you have controls in place designed to meet those frameworks. Is it a certificate? No, but you can demonstrate to your clients that you have the controls in place and you've had a third party come in and attest to the fact that they were suitably designed and operating effectively.
This is just an opinion. However, when some of our clients obtain the certificate for the 27001, they like the certificate from their clients that they obtain it from or their service providers. However, they also ask for a SOC report because the SOC report is more detailed. It has more information of how the control's operating.
Yeah, I think that's right. The certificate is essentially a one-pager. And then you've got a SOC report, which is very detailed. In fact, sometimes a little too detailed, if you may ask many of our clients. But it's still a good option. Next, I want to go over HITRUST. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what HITRUST is, and then if you can just very quickly walk us through the different domains in HITRUST and how an assessment might work. So the HITRUST Alliance is an organization that is actually headed in Frisco, Texas, is headquartered in Frisco, Texas. And it's developed a framework that is dubbed the Common Security Framework, or CSF. Now, I think HITRUST actually did something very wise, and it noticed that there was a bit of a vacuum, in particular for HIPAA compliance. For a long time, there's been laws and regulations around the protection of healthcare data, EPHI, and a requirement for those organizations that have PHI to comply with HIPAA. However, there was not a governing certification or a standardized process where companies could demonstrate their compliance with HIPAA. HITRUST, I think, did a very good job filling that void and developing a very detailed framework which covers multiple domains. Does it cover HIPAA compliance? You can get into the technicalities of yes or no. There's not necessarily an HHS sponsored certification, but in theory, yes, it should cover HIPAA compliance. It's also mapped to several other frameworks that is a pretty comprehensive set. So there's a brief overview of HITRUST. Jesus, maybe you can walk us through the ins and outs of the different domains and what they cover.
Yeah, definitely, John. Thank you. So HITRUST has 19 domains. Now, it sounds daunting when you say 19 domains. However, if you take a look at how they break down the domains, they've actually made it very specific. The first domain is Information Protection Program. Endpoint Protection is the second one. And Portable Media Security is the third domain. Those basically are the same thing. How you protect your data, the information that comes in, how do you secure data at rest, and how do you prevent it from actually walking out of the door through some sort of USB or email. The next domain is Mobile Device Security. Nowadays, everybody has access to the client information on a phone or email that is attached to a phone. So they have some controls around that. Wireless security most specifically refers to the location. Nowadays, what location doesn't have a wireless connectivity in the office? Configuration management, vulnerability management, network protection, they kind of have the same overlap where it's talking about identifying your risks, making sure that you address them, and make sure that you have controls to identify those risks. One unique domain that is in HITRUST is they're looking for password management. Password management is commonly a best practice to have strong passwords, so make sure you secure them, make sure you use them. With the high trust domain, they're actually looking for you to have some sort of technical tool to enforce your password policy. Access controls, we kind of discussed that earlier, what it is, just making sure you onboard and deword people timely, make sure their permissions are granted correctly. Audit logging and monitoring, as it stands, you want to make sure that you have the capabilities to not only have those tools that might identify a breach or a risk, but you actually have a way to detect it. Nowadays, most tools will send a lot of data out, but if you don't have the resources to process that data, it can turn into just white noise. So they're looking for a way for you to constantly review those logs that your tools provide. Education, training, and awareness, as it stands, making sure that your staff is trained, know how to identify, what could potentially harm. The best example I can give is they're actually put it in as a domain that you have some sort of security awareness training. Third-party assurance, making sure that your service providers are reviewed to make sure that they're operating as they intend, making sure that they're not putting your data at risk. The fifth domain, which is number 15, incident management. As it stands, you have a way to identify your events, catalog and documenting, respond to them, which leads to business continuity and risk management. So it's more of the same, where we need to make sure your disaster recovery is in place. You have a way to address your risk and verify that you have contingency plans for it. And then the next one is very standard to all domains, physical security. As it sounds, do you have data centers on your location? What kind of environmental controls do you have to protect the data? At the entry of the office, what kind of controls do you have to keep like a random person off the street to walk into your location? And the last domain is data protection and privacy. So if you think about the SOC privacy that we talked earlier, it's the same thing. What data do you have in your organization? How do you protect it? How do you make sure it's used for intended uses only? And how do you dispose of it when you no longer need it?
Yeah, so fantastic overview. There's a lot of content there, right? So 19 domains, it's pretty extensive. One thing that I think HITRUST has done well is that with their framework, they've published a crosswalk to other frameworks. So you can see specifically how that domain or particular control component might map to other frameworks. It's a really efficient way for you to govern your control activities and your compliance efforts, because it's really easy for you to track what frameworks a certain control may comply with. Now, let's go over the certification process for HITRUST. One of the unique things about each one of these control requirements in HITRUST is that it's governed by a maturity level. So you can comply with this particular control requirement through 1 through 5 levels. Those 5 levels are policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. And so you're essentially benchmarked and graded against those different maturity levels. So how does the certification process work? Well, you can start with a self-assessment, which is essentially exactly what it sounds like. You perform a self-assessment or readiness assessment. There's no certification, there's no test opinion with a self-assessment. From that point forward, then you've got one of 2 options. I'll start with the first one. The first option is a validated assessment. A validated assessment must be done by a third-party HITRUST assessor. Essentially, they do the audit work, they submit the work to HITRUST, and HITRUST issues a certificate. The second option is you can engage a CPA firm to do SOC 2 plus HITRUST. The CPA firm does the audit work, they develop the report, and the CPA firm issues the SOC 2 plus HITRUST. So it depends on what your customers are asking for, what you're required to do by contract, but there are some very good options for you to demonstrate HITRUST compliance to your customers and business partners that you might work with. So Jesus, we've gone over a lot of things here. Any final words of wisdom on how to select a framework, and maybe some of the best reporting options available to us given everything that's in front of us.
So the first recommendation that I would make is make sure you look at your contracts. Make sure that whatever governance your clients have on the contracts is being met. We can recommend whichever framework. However, if you have something specific in a contract that you're not meeting, then you're gonna be in a world of hurt, for use a technical term there. However, that would be my first recommendation. My second recommendation is, as a service provider, the more common report is, which is also an industry report, is a SOC report. That's what we're seeing nowadays. Anybody who provides services on behalf of your clients most likely has been requested for a SOC report.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly true. And I think it's a very flexible option for you if you need to provide a report to a customer who wants to see your particular controls that can comply with several different frameworks. I think it's sound words of wisdom, Jesus, as always. So I thank you for your contribution. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. We will be back with more in this podcast series. But for now, this is Whitley Penn Talks, and thank you everyone for joining.